we've got a solution. So it's essentially retroactive public goods funding. You guys might have heard of this. Vitalik talks about it, and the people from Optimism, and the idea essentially of impact markets is a retroactive public goods fund. So the idea is that you find someone, what we call a success payer, or you could call it a retroactive funder or a funder, that agrees to purchase essentially successful clinical trial data. And then on the basis of that agreement, now you have a market for investors to go in and fund, impact investors to go in and fund clinical trials. Now, this could be done off-chain. As you can see, it's quite simple. Like, you just need a payer, and that could be, ideally, that should be like a government or a health insurer. People that are basically paying like tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions, actually, they pay around $500 billion a year in monopoly price drugs. They could potentially save, billions and billions of dollars if you could come up with a very cheap off-patent drug that might even be better than the patented drug. So that sort of creates, that's a great incentive for a payer to basically, maybe pay you $100 million for the data, the information that proves that this off-patent drug is very effective. So that's what creates a market for data. And so there are these advantages. Also, you might say, okay, well, why don't we just get the government? Why don't we just get the government to pay for these, like the NIH, to do directly fund clinical trials? The problem with this is, like, anyone that understands like where the government is involved in these massive, expensive projects, they usually turn into these big white elephants, where they just spend, they might spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on research that doesn't work. And it's because it's centralized. Government doesn't necessarily know how to pick the winners. But with this pay for success model, you're creating a market, and then there's a risk transfer from wherever the payers are onto the market, who is more willing to take risks and fail fast. Technology, also pharma and the biotech industry have the best people. They've got the best technology, the best R&D, and they're incentivized to basically do that. Also, free market is, as we, some might disagree, but it's very, as long as the incentives are right, it's very efficient at allocating resources and failing quickly. And also low costs. So repurposed generic drugs potentially could outcompete patented drugs, because essentially the payers, whoever is paying for them, they might pay like $50,000 per quality, like what they call a quality is quality adjusted life year. That's how usually payers figure out how much they want to pay for drugs. But using these impact markets, you get much lower cost per quality, maybe even 1/100th of the cost. So we think this, the future of NFTs, basically, you could use them to fund public good medicines. We've got Bored Ape Yacht Club, or $3 billion market cap. You've got people raising $150 million to buy a copy of the Constitution. What if they could put their money into funding public good medicines, pre-purchasing public good medicines, where they're de-risked, they're only going to pay for successful clinical trials? And that's what basically we think is a way to create these impact markets we need, and to create a market for retroactive funding. We're proposing open source pharma IP NFTs. So these are basically things that once you've got the retroactive funding, then you get investors to invest in the clinical trials. And these things are essentially hypercerts, and they allow fractionalization of ownership and basically ownership of clinical trial data around a particular treatment protocol. Let's say, you work out this off-patent drug is really great for treating cancer. You can create and you think it's going to be really good. You can mint this open source Pharma IP NFT to allow fractionalization to raise a few $1 million to do the clinical trials. And then these open source Pharma NFTs are the ones that create the actual market for the retroactive public goods funding. Then there's a question of like, how are we going to allocate that retroactive public goods funding to the owners of the IP NFTs that are successful? And Cyrus is going to be the one running through that sort of that flow. But we've got essentially this medical impact DAO. And what happens is it's based on this thing that I did for my thesis called the that I was relying on for my thesis. It's done by a couple of academics, Aidan Hollis and Thomas Boggy. It was called the Medical Impact Fund. And this is a medical impact DAO. And basically, we've got the crowdfunding that comes in, we've got a big prize fund, and then 20%, say, of the prize fund or a fixed amount of that prize fund is payable every year to successful clinical trials. And what happens is you have IP NFTs, which are minted to raise money for the clinical trials. And if they're successful, they turn into hypercerts, having a number of impact points. And the number of impact points is determined because these clinical trials are very formalized. You can compare them. You can say the clinical trial is a randomized controlled trial where you compare your off-patent drug versus usual care. And then if your off-patent drug is 50% better than usual care, then you get 50 impact points. And that determines how long you can be registered, how much you get of the prize fund is distributed proportionally. 20% of it is distributed proportionally every year between those proportional to impact points. And also after a while, the impact points get deregistered, basically, say 5 years, and then that increases proportionally the amount of clinical trials that might have money that might be available. And the idea is that after a while, there's this kind of equilibrium that's reached, where basically impact investors get around 10% return on their investments. So they do the MPV, they like work out the net present value of the chance that if they put in $1 million for this clinical trial, what's the chance that I'm going to make 10% return on my investment? And then they'll look at the money that's available from the outcome payments from the prize, and then they'll decide whether they want to fund it or they want to register or not. So basically this market equilibrium is reached automatically, and what we want is just everyone to basically put their money in the top funnel, and that will automatically allocate it to the people on the bottom funnel. And also we've got Cyrus, and he's going to basically run through this and demonstrate it, but it's a de-risking mechanism. And the idea, I'll just mention in the next slide, the idea is once we've got an optimal treatment protocol, say for an off-patent drug, then we would negotiate what's called an advanced market commitment with payers, like say health insurers and governments, to get the funding to get this through to FDA approval. And so where they basically agree, we'll pay you $100 million if you can get this drug through and get it to FDA approval on the basis that will save like $200 million or more. So we're happy to do that. And it's the same sort of prize mechanism. But initially we want to do this de-risking thing, and that's where I will pass it on to Cyrus